the thing is, you see, Australia also faces a crisis with fertiliser. Now, we just aren't a mining country. We are also a farming one. And our weakness in that is that we don't actually make much of our own fertiliser. We import most of it from overseas, more than $3 billion a year. For instance, 2/3 of our phosphate rock comes from China alone. Its foot on our throat. And with China's export bans, because China and Russia are the two biggest suppliers, exporters of fertiliser to the world, both countries have banned or severely limited exports. And now there's a worldwide shortage of fertiliser, prices have soared, and there are now reports warning that Australia's wheat harvest alone could drop by 20% over the next year, in part because farmers just can't afford the fertiliser. And that's just Australia. Imagine the real hunger now facing the third world. This is the warning now. We could be back to starvation in some countries if we don't get this sort of thing fixed, these supply lines for fertiliser. Joining me is someone who's warned about our particular vulnerability for years, National Senator Matt Canavan, the former Resources Minister. Matt Canavan, thank you so much for your time. How serious is this problem?
Well, it's not just me saying this now, Andrew. It's the US President only a few weeks ago said food shortages will be real. The Bank of England Governor today said there'd be massive global food shortages in the months to come. And this is all a consequence of the crazy, green, insane policies that various Western countries primarily have adopted in the past few years. You've wonderfully highlighted the example of Sri Lanka, which is a microcosm there, and the issues that arose in Sri Lanka were local ones. But Western countries have fallen into the same sort of traps here by closing down their production of energy, of fossil fuels. And I mean, do you know, you probably see a lot of these student protesters on our streets about climate change, and they often hold up placards saying you can't eat coal or you can't eat gas. And it just beggars belief of me that young kids in this country aren't taught how food is actually grown. About half of the world's food comes from fertilisers that are made using primarily natural gas or some sort of fossil fuel. The carbon in those fossil fuels is extracted effectively to create a fertiliser. And so when you restrict the development of gas, of oil and coal, you will restrict the ability of the world to grow food. And as you've highlighted there, poor people, primarily poor people, will go hungry.
And what do we have to do? There's two problems here, isn't there? One is this crusade against fossil fuels, which are actually crucial in making fertilisers which feed the world. But the second issue here is our reliance on imports from Russia and China and the rest of the world. We can't be that dependent anymore. What do we need to do about it?
Well, we need to both back the construction of new fertiliser plants and develop more oil and gas, in particular resources, to underpin supply for new ones. So we do have a urea. Urea is the most commonly used fertiliser in Australia, and there's a urea plant now in Brisbane. Unfortunately, while the Glasgow conference was on last year, do you remember that? Do you remember when we're going to completely change the planet?
I do, and I remember it closed.
Before Vladimir Putin popped up. It's sort of in the distant rearview mirror now. But while that Glasgow conference was on, an Australian company, Incitec Pivot, announced that it would be shutting down that urea plant later this year in Brisbane. The reason for that is we do not have access to affordable sources of natural gas in Eastern Australia anymore because the Bass Strait has declined. Now, fortunately, the federal government is backing the construction of a new urea plant at Karratha in Western Australia. There is oil and gas abundant offshore there, but we just need to find new sources of oil and gas. So that's why the federal government is backing the development of the Beetaloo Basin, our first shale basin. Incitec Pivot, instead of having a Brisbane plant, an Australian company, they've built urea plants in Louisiana because that's where, until recently, the affordable natural gas has been. But under the Biden administration, they're putting more red tape and costs on the gas industry, and gas prices in the US are now near where they are here in Australia, in fact. So this is a problem around the whole world, but primarily we've got to get through to people's heads, especially our leaders, that the decisions have consequences. When you follow a 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirl and let her run your energy and food systems, you're going to cause people to starve.
Exactly.
Climate change is not causing people to starve, but climate change policies are literally causing people to starve right now because they have completely destroyed our ability to grow food across the world.
Look at Sri Lanka. Green dreaming, look at the results. Do not, with our stupid phobias against coal, against gas, against uranium, against so many things now, don't put ourselves in the same position. Matt Canavan, thank you so much for fighting this fight.